Good morning. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we welcome you to the event Multilateralism in the COVID-19 Era. This will be a conversation between IDB President Luis Alberto Moreno and former World Bank President Robert Zoellick on development and multilateralism during the pandemic and his new book, America in the World. This event will be held in English with interpretation into Spanish. Para escuchar el evento en español, haga clic en el icono del mundo que encontrará en la parte baja de su pantalla y seleccione el idioma. Please send your questions to paulc@iadb.org. President Moreno, please go ahead.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome Bob Zoellick, who is one of the great U.S. thinkers. He's not only served in a number of administrations, he's been Deputy Secretary of State, U.S. Trade Representative. He's equally worked at Treasury. He's also had a fantastic career throughout his years, and of course, his last public job was running the World Bank, in which I had a tremendous opportunity to work with him, not only there, but in my days as Ambassador of Colombia to the United States. And having said that, his new book is really fascinating, and it's really one of those books that I think is a must for any diplomat coming to the United States and understanding the historical context, not only of the personalities, but equally the processes on which policy making and foreign policy is made. So with that, I would start with Bob by asking you, why this book, and why did you decide to write this book?
Well, first, Luis Alberto, let me thank you and the Inter-American Development Bank for having me. We've had a long engagement over the years, and I really appreciate all of what you and the staff have done at the bank. So I had the idea for the book about 20 years ago when I read a book that Henry Kissinger wrote titled Diplomacy. And in that book, Kissinger used history to talk about foreign policy and diplomacy. But I always had a sense it was written from a European perspective. So I wanted to write something that talked about the American experience and some of the ideas that had developed over 200 plus years. So the approach I took, as you alluded to, was to focus on stories of people and particular episodes. And unlike some books on foreign policy that focus on intellectual frameworks, I wanted to deal with the practical work of how people try to solve problems and perhaps share some insights about the nature of diplomacy. And I suppose one of the other goals I had was that I enjoyed studying diplomatic history years ago. And the field is somewhat faded, in part because, for good reason, people have brought in sort of underrepresented groups and actors and perspectives. But I think something was lost, something that people no longer did a synthesis. Fred Logoval, who's a historian at Harvard, said, "Why have we stopped writing political history?" So I wanted to try to retrieve a little bit of that. And I've actually been encouraged, since the book has come out, some professors have written to me that they're going to use it with their classes at various universities, which would perhaps influence another generation. And I guess the last thought is, during recent years, the United States has had very extensive power. And I noticed that former Secretary of Defense Mattis even said he was surprised in some circumstances how the US had lost all domain dominance. And as I reflected even on my experience before the end of the Cold War, and certainly the historical experience before that, there were many times the United States had to work with modest influence or even weakness. And I think that's a good perspective to have as you consider diplomacy.
One of the interesting things that you have, we always think in Latin America that somehow there's a mismatch in where Latin America's thinking is. And probably I think the US typically has something similar. And very early in your book, you write about Henry Clay, which was this great, thoughtful policymaker, and how somehow he developed this set of ideas in which he wanted to have a very broad agenda with Latin America, and he never made it to Panama. But talk to us a little bit about that time of Henry Clay and how throughout the years you've seen this Latin America-US relationship evolve, which you have it in a number of chapters. And of course, you give an importance, a very big importance, of course, to North America.
So I partly wanted to tell Henry Clay's story because, as you mentioned, in some ways it's symbolic of relations up and down over the course of centuries. So for people on the call, Henry Clay was a member of Congress, Speaker of the House, also senator from Kentucky, sort of the second generation of American leaders. He was very influential from 1810 to 1850. He was known in US history as the negotiator of many of the pre-Civil War compromises to try to keep the Union together. He was the leader of the Whig Party, which was the opposition party to Andrew Jackson's Democrats. He ran for president a number of times, never quite made it. Interestingly, the current majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, has a great respect for Henry Clay as his skill as a deal maker. So it shows how these figures continue to have influence over time. But what I wanted to talk about in this book was that Clay was also a man of vision as well as a very shrewd political leader. He framed what in American politics was known as the American system. And what that was supposed to involve was, how do you tie the different sectional interests of the young United States together with infrastructure, an internal market. He was a supporter of the National Bank. He supported some tariffs to help sort of early manufacturing. But one of the things I discovered was in his very first speech introducing the idea of the American system, which was in 1820, he put it in hemispheric terms. And he was a great supporter, for people recall at this time in the late teens, or early 1820s, of the early independence movements of the Latin American republics. In a way, he was one of the people who believed in a new world that could be a counterpoint to the old world. And so he saw the possibility of republican systems, small r republican systems, commerce, sort of a network of ties, a neutral politics sort of separate from what at that time was the monarchy and mysticism of European politics, because after the Napoleonic War, people remember there was an effort to reassert control of the old order, including in Spain, which was obviously the home of most of the Latin American republics. So Clay becomes Secretary of State in 1825 under John Quincy Adams. And at that moment, there is the creation of something called the Panama Congress, sponsored by a number of the different sort of Latin American states. And Clay saw this as a wonderful opportunity to develop what he called the good neighborhood policies. And he wrote a rather long document, about 18,000 words of a set of instructions, which of all the documents he wrote over a long career, he considered one of his most important state papers. And it was an effort to suggest how the hemisphere could come together on commerce, neutrality, actually quite liberal immigration policies, an openness on religion. And when people recognized at that time the difference between Catholics and Protestants was pretty strong, an importance of sort of property and maritime works. And of course, he was a supporter of infrastructure. He's one of the first people that talks about a trans-isthmus canal. But he had to deal with domestic politics. And John Quincy Adams had become president, even though Jackson had gotten more popular votes, and it's required it to go to the House of Representatives. Clay had thrown his support to Adams. Clay becomes Secretary of State. The Jacksonians say, you know, this is the corrupt deal that made Adams president. And they made his life miserable. And in particular, in 1826, the whole first session of Congress was tied up trying to get approval of the emissaries to go to this Panamanian Congress and get the appropriations for it. It becomes a very bitter sort of political fight. And one of the Jacksonians actually says, look, we almost won, and if they'd taken the other side, we would have beaten them for sure. which certainly suggests that they didn't care so much about the policy as they cared about sort of winning the political fight. So it turns out that after the approval, one of the emissaries to the Panama Congress dies on the way. The other gets as far as Mexico, doesn't even get to Panama by the time the Congress is convened. And so the Panama Congress is supposed to reconvene in Mexico, but never does. So this is a diplomatic setback, but it's, in some ways it's also symbolic of this frustrating cycle of some in the US seeking partnership with Latin America, but then the detachment and disappointment that follows.
Well, speaking of Panama, you talk of two very important secretaries of state, Elihu Root, who basically was the Secretary of State under President Theodore Roosevelt. He was critical in the rebuilding of, or really the finishing of the Panama Canal. And actually another one was Cordell Hull, which is, as you were talking on this whole idea of that meeting in Panama, was about trade. And he really began to be a very important policymaker on trade issues. Talk to us a little bit about, Cordell Hull and what he meant for trade and how he projected American ideas on trade.
So Cordell Hull was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, and he actually turned out to be the longest serving American Secretary of State. He served some 11 years and 9 months. He had a long background in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, briefly in the Senate. And he was a strong believer in the benefits of trade beyond economic efficiency. So he believed the trade and foreign policy connection was fundamental. So in my chapter on Hull, I try to draw together issues that would affect policy today, give a window on trade, the constitutional role of Congress, sort of domestic politics. And some of your audience may recall that in 1930, the Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley bill, which was a very protectionist bill. So this is under the prior president, Hoover. Most economists believe it was very important in deepening the Great Depression. The average US tariff runs up to 59%. Depending on whether you use volume or dollar measures, US trade drops between 40 and 70%. So it's a calamity, and it's a huge calamity, obviously, in the relations with Latin America. So in 1934, Hull is able to convince Franklin Roosevelt to support something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And for students of politics today, it would be amazing because it's only 3 pages of the whole act. But it ended up being a historic piece of legislation because the idea was to shift from Congress setting individual tariffs on thousands of items to giving the executive branch the authority to negotiate tariff reductions in trade agreements. So unlike the current system, these agreements didn't have to go back to Congress, but they were limited in terms of the tariff reduction. And frankly, this started the shift from Congress to the executive branch authority of trade that many on this call will associate with either fast track or trade promotion authority. And so that's the system that's operated for 80 years since, under the principle that normally the executive branch is more trade liberalizing than the individual members of Congress. Frankly, until Donald Trump, this is the sort of the break in that tradition. But so during his tenure, Hull negotiates 31 agreements with some 28 countries. Many of them are in Latin America to reduce the tariffs, but equally important, these simple agreements establish the basic principles that then go into the GATT and later the WTO system. For example, most favored nation, unconditional most favored nation. So if you lower the tariff for one, everybody that has most favored nation status gets the benefit of that. Non-discrimination, and also trying to change barriers of all sorts into tariffs so you can slowly reduce them. Those become critical principles in the post-Cold War system. But I emphasize these trade issues are never easy. So even after Hull gets the legislative authority, he has a rousing battle with a man named George Peake, who basically supports what today we would call managed trade or barter. So some of this will sound a little familiar to present ideas, because Peake said, look, all that rules-based system, that's too complex. Let's do a deal with countries where we'll give them cotton and they'll give us wine, and doesn't necessarily, it'll be more of a barter system. And this becomes a very sensitive issue because at that time, Brazil was also a major cotton producer, and it would interfere with Brazil's sales and the US effort to develop an agreement with Brazil. Peake makes a fatal mistake, however. One of his key agreements is with Nazi Germany in the 30s. Roosevelt actually approves the agreement, but Hull is one of the few people who beat Roosevelt in his own politics, because he explains how the economics of the deal would be bad, but he also says this will allow Nazi Germany not to have to use hard currency for trade and spend more for armaments. And there are many people in the United States that won't think that's such a good idea. So FDR actually sort of changes his approach. In World War II, it's interesting, a point that Hull makes is that the political alignment really does follow the economic alignment. In other words, the countries with which he had negotiated these trade agreements become supporters of the Allies. In the case of Brazil, it not only is the critical, people forget this, critical bridge for the air bridge across from the United States to Brazil, to Africa, up to Europe and Britain, but Brazil actually supplies ground forces, the smoking cobras, as I recall, to fight in Italy in World War II. Now, I think the reality is people learn that trade can't ensure peace. But what Hull was pointing to, which is applicable to today, is it can build prosperity and friendships. Certainly economic miseries, as we've seen in Latin America, can threaten political systems. To a degree, it can lessen the risk of conflicts. But it still doesn't, it's not a guarantee of peace, and as you could see in relations with the US and China today. But the US uses this system after World War II to create the most successful international economic model the world has seen in terms of growth. And just to give you a little sense of how these things come back, when I became trade representative in 2001, students of trade will recall we'd had the failure in Seattle to launch the next global trade round. And I took some of Hull's ideas of could we use bilateral agreements to also create a competition, to create also regional and global agreements. And we used that to launch the Doha round. But simultaneously, I pushed very hard for the bilateral free trade agreements that build on NAFTA. So the agreements that the US has with Latin America today, with Chile, with Peru, with Colombia, with the 5 countries of Central America and the Dominican Republic, with Panama, these all grow out of this strategy. And just to give you a sense of where politics matters, if I had been in office, I would have actually tried to take those agreements and build something regional. In a sense, this is what the Bush 43 and Obama administration tried to do with TPP. It took some of the Latin American partners with Asian partners, but of the 11 additional economies, 6 of them we already had free trade agreements with. So it's the notion of not whether bilateral FTAs conflict with a multilateral system, but how you can use them to sort of keep the momentum going forward. And maybe this will be an idea important for the future, because right now the trading system is under severe stress.
Well, on that, we have a lot of people sending questions, but one related to that is there's a lot of talk of changes around value chains. There's actually a very interesting study that was done by Bank of America saying, how much, US corporates are going to try to rethink their value chains, where they're going. There's more nearshoring. Where do you see, given, what you were saying, which is absolutely on the mark, is essentially how to roll up all these trade agreements into one, which will give a lot of, true gains of trade. Do you see an opportunity for, I've been talking with you years ago about this notion of made in the Americas, where we can today see a lot of Asian production coming to the Americas to source equally the North American market. Do you see that doable given all the challenges of COVID?
Well, particularly with a group like the Inter-American Development Bank, I think people are keenly aware that the trading system is always evolving. So even before the pandemic, you were seeing changes in the supply chains and logistics systems. Some of them were becoming more regionally focused, and this reflected changes in China. you were actually seeing that the labor wage rate arbitrage was becoming less important and more some of the sort of the digital connections. And also the changes of technology. So even 3D manufacturing may create different opportunities to move from a world of large batches of sort of commodity assembled products over great areas to on-site customized sort of smaller developments. I think that the pandemic and the conflicts with China have exacerbated this. And so there's a greater interest on the part of companies of having flexibility, greater adaptability, sort of multiple sourcing, different inventory controls. And certainly that should provide some opportunities for Latin American economies. The most natural would be Mexico. But of course, this depends on the investment environment with Mexico. And while I think the USMCA has a good part in that it shows us that after 30 years of integration, even Trump and Lopez Obrador, who probably didn't like it so much, couldn't kill it. But some of the changes, I'm afraid, are not so good in terms of investment provisions and some of the other sort of controls, but at least it sort of continues in force. But as for your larger question, you know, I think we're in an era now, Luis Alberto, where the forces of protectionism are gathering sort of weight in all countries. That's potentially quite dangerous, and it's quite dangerous for a lot of the middle-income trading countries in Latin America. My guess is that my own view is Trump is a protectionist. This won't change under Trump. He is sort of the managed trade idea. If Biden wins, he's going to have a lot on his plate, and a lot of the Democratic constituencies in Congress, as you know, are not pro-free trade. But maybe if you can link it with some environmental reforms, some sort of carbon issues, and frankly, some of the labor standards issues that they would want to emphasize, I hope that there's some ability to sort of rebuild constituencies, because what you see in the polls is actually now Democratic voters are more pro-trade, but the union interest remains often resistant. And so whether younger people with a greater sense of international connectivity can build this, but the politics of trade are always extremely difficult. And I mean, just to share one other story from the book that I found, there's a man named Will Clayton, who's the negotiator of the GATT in 1947. So there were only 23 economies at this point, and the Congress passes a 50% tariff on wool. And that would have driven the Australians out of the negotiation. If the Australians went, Britain with the Commonwealth would have gone. The Europeans wouldn't have seen much benefit. So Clayton comes all the way back to the United States to meet President Truman. And Truman gives him 15 minutes and the Secretary of Agriculture 15 minutes. And the Secretary of Agriculture says things that I've heard in many meetings. He said, oh, you'll lose up to 7 or 8 states in the 1948 election. Who cares about the international trade issue? You have to sign this bill. And Will Clayton says, look, you have to give us a chance to build this international trading system to help recover from World War II. Truman vetoes the bill and actually gives them the authority to make a tariff cut of wool of 25%. So the negotiation goes forward. And I like that story because there's an attitude sometimes to say, oh, well, you know, after World War II, the United States had a dominant economy. We could afford to be liberalized. This shows the politics of this has always been tough, and it depends on leadership at the top.
And that takes me to another point that, you know, in looking at your book, you go through what in Latin America, at least the US had, it went from gunboat diplomacy, you know, charging, you know, in the case of Venezuela, when they had not paid some bills, and then to the Alliance of Progress, you know, and now looking at the consequences, as we were talking earlier before starting this program, you know, if you look at the Great Depression, it was really the turnaround in the US economy that brought back Latin American economies. You and I were together in the midst of the financial crisis, and it was really emerging markets that brought up the rest of the world. How do you see this playing out going forward, and what would the US have to do if we continue to see these tremendous losses of all these social gains that Latin America saw over the last 20 years or more?
Well, it's interesting. We talked about Henry Clay, but there's a series of people who try to figure out different ways to reach out to Latin America. So there was a man named James Blaine in the 1890s. He starts the first reciprocity agreements and actually also creates the Pan American Union. But Congress thwarts them and we're off in a bad direction again. You mentioned Elihu Root, who was a wonderful promoter of US relations with Latin America. He takes a very long visit to Latin America. And I partly recall this because when I was US trade representative, my first counterpart in Brazil was Celso Laffer, who was the foreign and trade minister. And on one of the visits, Celso gave me a quote from Elihu Root, which is a wonderful sense of how, about kind of how these traditions can carry forward in a positive way. And Root also was one of the founders, since we've talked about Central America. Turns out Central America created the first Court of Justice, which was the first sort of international arrangement on an ongoing basis, endowed with continuing functions, but eventually it falters. He was a big supporter of arbitration over fisheries with Canada. And then FDR starts the Good Neighbor policy, which is basically an effort to avoid some of the armed intervention of the past, as you referred to. After World War II, you have another movement. So this is the creation of the OAS in 1948. Many people may not recall, but the Rio Security Treaty of 1947 actually has the language that later became the formula for NATO. So it's actually started in Latin America. And then, of course, in the Eisenhower administration, you have the creation of the IDB in 1959. The Alliance for Progress under JFK is another one of these efforts in 1961. And if you look at their original idea, part of this was driven by their Cold War anxieties about sort of communism and threats in Latin America. But they wanted it to be more inter-American, but it became more just sort of a foreign assistance program. The Peace Corps, which has brought a lot of other Americans to Latin America. Issues of Cuban security, which continue to deal with us today. The Panama Canal. And then the more modern period, you get the oil dollars that from price that flowed into Latin America, led to the debt crises that I dealt with when I was at the Treasury kind of in the 80s. That, of course, helps lead to some of the critical macroeconomic reforms in the 80s and 90s that create the basis for growth. Clinton had the Summit for the Americas as a way of trying to say we could have the first democratic hemisphere, almost going back to sort of Henry Clay's idea. He had the free trade area of the Americas, which was a little more vision than practice, sort of how you approach these things. And I think to bring your question up to today, there always has to be a recognition of the political shifts on all sides. So, you know, during this era in Latin America, you've got military regimes, you've got populists of the left and right, you've got democracies. As you know, from the Colombian case, the difficult problems of narcotics, not only as a drug, but as an organized crime, and frankly, can threaten the nature of the state, which Plan Colombia, which you were part of, helped sort of overcome. So I guess what I would bring it to is the following, and this reflects a little bit my own personal experience. As you know, I'm not one of those Americans who became a Latin American specialist. So there's a group of Americans that devoted their career to that. I worked globally, Europe, Asia, all over. But because I worked a lot on economic issues, I started to work on debt, trade, investment issues with Latin America. And my view of Latin America's long-term strength was always that it had to adapt to a global environment. So not just the north-south with the hegemon to the north. But as you know, when we worked together when I was at the World Bank, part of my view was, how can Latin America compete with East Asia? How can it develop relations also sort of with Africa? How can we strengthen Latin America's capacity to operate globally? And so this has different dimensions. So as for today, you know, obviously, I hope that as we come up with better treatments and vaccines for Latin America, or for the United States, that there will be an effort to try to include these regionally and take care of other sort of populations. You know, President Bush 43 did this with HIV/AIDS in Africa, and was probably the best thing US ever did in African history. So there's an opportunity here to try to do this. as I've mentioned, I think in some countries in the region, you have the danger of fragility and sort of whether criminal networks. And here, as you may recall, when I was at the bank, I tried to create some attention to the particular problems of how do you draw together security, economic, and governance disciplines together, because they tended to operate in separate spheres. And that's something I know you've worked on sort of in the region. So I think over time, if you have a democratic administration, there will be focus on climate. There'll be focus on sort of different environmental and energy issues. The pandemic also raises, I think, a bigger point about what I'll call biological security. So, this is not going to be a one-off. When I was talking with a very respected virologist a couple weeks ago, he said, look, we get about 5 of these a year, and 3 of them are actually related to the wildlife trade. So in the trading space, probably we'll also have greater attention to sort of wildlife set of trafficking issues. So I think the agenda evolves. It still needs inclusive economic growth, but I think the formula for the future, and this is where I think the development banks can play a key role, is integrating these different disciplines, whether it's environmental, whether it's governance, whether it's the sort of security rule of law framework, inclusive economic growth. And obviously, as you know, it always depends on the politics within the countries. I mean, at the end of the day, I felt in development, outsiders can't do it for countries. You can bring knowledge, you can bring resources, you can bring expertise, but it has to be owned by the local people.
Speaking of politics within countries, back in 2005, you delivered a speech that was very, very important in kind of setting out the challenges between China and the United States. It became known as the stakeholder approach that you mentioned. And it was actually a speech that invited China to work together with the United States and develop, kind of the adjustments, let's call it, to this new world we're in, and essentially to rethink about areas of multilateralism and whatnot. Fast forward to today, of course, and the tension between China and the US is just about in every field, from technology to human rights, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to the South China Sea. And that, of course, has huge implications for the world and certainly for Latin America, especially South America, where today you have countries like Brazil, like Argentina, Chile, or Peru, where China has become their top trading partner. How do you see this whole China-US tensions evolving?
Well, it gives me no pleasure to say so, but I think the relationship is in free fall, and it's quite dangerous. To set the context, for people who wouldn't have known about that speech, what I was trying to do in 2005 was recognize that for decades, the US and Europe and others had been wanting to integrate China into the international system. And by 2005, I pointed out, China was a member of the WTO, World Bank, IMF, UN Security Council, various treaties from ozone depletion to weapons proliferation. And so I was suggesting that we needed to move beyond the goal of integration to sharing responsibilities. So the notion was, could China be a responsible stakeholder? So some of the people who comment on the speech ought to actually go back and take a look and read it, because I didn't say China was a responsible stakeholder. I said we should push it to be. But the speech had a good reception in China, because even though they realized the US would be evaluating responsibility, it paid China the respect that I think it was due with its accomplishments. And that led to an observation I wrote up in an article in the National Interest for people interested in it this year in March and April. The new conventional wisdom is, well, we tried cooperation and it failed. And that's just flat historically wrong. I talk about how China had moved from actually being a wartime enemy or a proxy with Vietnam and North Korea to a lot of cooperation on proliferation issues. If you think in the economic area, it was the largest source of global growth. China quit manipulating its exchange rate. The current account surplus went from 10% to zero. And even on the WTO, where the rules were quantitative, China met its obligations. The problem was in many of the areas that were qualitative, like forced technology transfer and others. And my point was not to say that all is well with China. I mean, I'm a believer that there's no holiday from the work of diplomacy. And I also believe that under President Xi, you have changes that also have their historical origins. So for many of us, the fall of the Soviet Union is a historical event. If you look at Xi Jinping, the shadow of the fall of the Soviet Union still casts the darkness over China. He's very concerned about the success of the Communist Party. And one of the anecdotes that I share on this is that when Xi Jinping took office in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union, ordered all the party cadres to see it. Well, if you had that film in Germany or Europe, it would say Gorbachev was the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version's a little different. Gorbachev is the guy that abandoned the Communist Party and ruined his country, and the not so subtle message is it won't happen here. So I think the danger is US policy started out, frankly, focusing on bilateral trade surpluses, which was quite narrow and I don't think has been successful. But now it's a broad-based confrontation. And instead, I would try to take this apart in pieces. So in security terms, I would use a strategy the US has had since Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a naval writer 100 years ago, where he was talking about the US interests are primarily in terms of a security perimeter in the Pacific, not getting involved with land conflicts in Asia, but making sure you have freedom of the seas. You need to do that with allies, which is very important in US strategy. And then you have to look for the basis of cooperation on other issues. So if you consider the future challenges of biological security, or inclusive economic growth, or environment and energy issues, or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, you're not going to be able to get very far unless you figure out how to work with China. And what I mentioned in this article is there's a record of having accomplished that. You won't be able to do it in every circumstance, but the US will be much better able to do it if we do it with partners in the region and including in Latin America, where we should have shown the common interest of this, and in Europe. And the one last point is some of the hostility to China actually has a defeatist strain. It's like the power of the Communist Party is going to overwhelm all our societies. In part because I first lived in Hong Kong in 1980, and I've certainly spent a lot of time there. China's not 10 feet tall. It's got a lot of internal problems, from demographics to the economics and others. And so I believe that the US and American democracies should still stand up for our views about freedom, but do so in a way like Reagan used to do, which is to emphasize aspirations as opposed to insult people. And so in practical terms, rather than trying to sanction leaders in Hong Kong, I would do what the British and the Australians are done, which is open space for people to come to the United States. That's the best way to show the choice between the two societies. And I'm very concerned about shutting off opportunities for students. I understand the need to watch out for espionage, but for the long run, I believe we should have students from all over the world come to the United States. It's the best thing we can do. And sad to say, I get more and more news about sort of animosities towards Asian Americans in the United States. So this has some dark sides to it too. So I don't think there's a simple formula here. And I don't think under Xi's regime, you can go back to the old system. But as my book outlines, much of foreign policy is practical problem solving. So what do you want to accomplish? What are your means? Who can you do it with? As opposed to just throw stones.
Well, one of the last chapters in your book talks about the 5 traditions of U.S. foreign policy, which I think is a must read for anybody coming to Washington to serve in any capacity. I would love that you could explain a bit how do you come to that and how you see one play with the other.
So as I said, the structure of the book, as we've discussed, is sort of people and stories and pragmatic events. So a lot of books tend to force messy facts into intellectual framers. I didn't want to do that. But on the other hand, looking across 200 plus years, I did draw out some traditions. So we've talked about a couple of them. One is the importance of trade and transnational and technology relations beyond economic efficiency. So if you go back to the founding of the United States, even in 1776, John Adams and others, they were trying to have the idea that trade would be their foreign policy because they were resisting a world of mercantilism and empires. Now, as part of that, they expected that private players would shape the world. And this leads to the world of missionaries and NGOs and civil society and others. A second tradition I talk about is the relation with alliances. So some students of American history will recall that George Washington, in his farewell address, warned about permanent alliances. Jefferson then warns about entangling alliances. So for 150 years, America avoids alliances. And it tries to develop other ways of engaging internationally, including trade, international law, arms control. But from 1947 to 49 on, the United States creates an alliance system connected to the international economic order that has really framed world politics for the last 70 or 80 years. It's a question of where will that go today? And then I also talk about the role of Congress in foreign policy. So you've been very effective with the US Congress, Luis Alberto, and you know that many foreign policy people sort of act as if that's a foreign actor. They don't know how to deal with it. And you can't be successful, as you know, unless you figure out how to do that. That's partly how you got your capital increases for. And more broadly, you need the support of the American public. And then another tradition is the idea of America's purpose. In here, I avoided exceptionalism, which is a word that antagonizes people sometimes from other countries. And instead, what I was saying is, from the start of the United States, people had the idea the country should serve a larger purpose. At first, it was just to show that a republic could survive. With the Civil War, it was to preserve the Union. And it changes over time. And the question will be, what will that be today? But there's one other sort of tradition, which is particularly relevant to this audience, which is I refocus attention on North America, because it's interesting. If you talk to most American foreign policy specialists, they'll talk about Europe or Asia or Mideast and sometimes Latin America, but North America, it doesn't make the cut. Now, what I wanted to emphasize is that in the 19th century, of course, North America was the heart of the foreign policy. Louisiana Purchase, Mexican War, agreements with Spain, with Britain. But even in the 20th century, the US almost went to war again with Mexico in 1916. In 1917, the Germans proposed to the Mexicans, look, if you go to war with us against the United States, we'll give you back Texaco, Mexico, or New Mexico and Arizona. They didn't include California. I don't know why they left out California. Or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which obviously is in the Caribbean, sort of the greatest nuclear showdown of the sort of the Cold War. NAFTA, which, as you know, was designed not just as a trade agreement, but to try to capture the changes in a democratizing, modernizing Mexico and link it sort of the North American system. And if you ask yourself, what do you hear from the American public today? Well, you hear concern about immigration from Mexico or Central America. You hear concern about economic sort of growth and integration. You hear concern about narcotics and organized crime and opiates and others. You can hear concern about environmental topics. All of those are part of the North American agenda. But I have a positive point too, which is that in my view, and William Seward actually in the 1860s first talks about this, for the United States to be most effective globally, we'd be better off with having close North American partnerships. So 500 million people, 3 democracies, integrated energy system, our demographics are better than the rest of the world. And I found this wonderful quote from Ronald Reagan. In 1979, as he launched his campaign, imagine, this is, if you were seeing Biden or Trump today, he has a number of paragraphs about the importance of North America. And he said, look, the United States is better off if Mexico and Canada are stronger, not weaker. And instead, he said, we should start to see our nearest neighbors as something other than foreigners. Whoa, that's quite a different from today. But so I partly try to retrieve the North American agenda because I think it's both where the public interest is, and it's a source of potential strength for all 3 of these economies. And, you know, if you ask yourself today, you know, I'm afraid with the pandemic and some of the other issues, Trump's wall, things like that, we've lost ground.
Well, speaking of which, as you look forward, the United States will have at the beginning of November an election, and what would be the difference in a Biden administration, and for that matter, what changes could a Trump administration in a second term have?
Well, without getting too political about it, well, I'm a Republican. I separated myself from 2016 on because I was worried not only about Trump's policies, I was concerned about character, assault on institutions and Constitution, and now we have a challenge of effectiveness. So I have to let others speak about Trump policies. On the Biden case, I guess what I'd share with you, I don't have any inside knowledge, but from a study of American politics, here's what I'd point out. If Biden's elected, he's going to have a huge domestic agenda. I mean, think about it. He's got the pandemic and frayed healthcare system. He's got inclusive economic recovery. He's got immigration issues. He's got climate and environmental issues. He's got race issues. It's huge. And as people know, and you in particular, the US Congress can only do so much, and there's certain amounts the executive can do. So even though I think a President Biden would be interested in the international agenda, and he's got a long set of relations, including I know he worked with the Central American countries, his attention will probably be best spent with the Congress, where he's got more experience than anybody as a president since LBJ. So while you'll hear a lot of issues that a Democratic administration would like to deal with, I think to be practical, what I would recommend is how do you leverage off the domestic agenda? And I have a piece I'm writing for online for Foreign Affairs, should be in September, people are interested in this, but let's take the immigration issue. If he can do something with Dreamers and some executive orders, why not connect that to an agenda for North America? Why not try to do some things to sort of re-strengthen our relations with sort of Mexico and Canada? If he does some things on climate change, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but try to figure out how we could bring developing countries into this, such as soil carbon with sub-Saharan Africa, or forestation and avoided deforestation, which has great possibilities in Latin America. For the pandemic, as I've mentioned, you know, why not do something that if we start to get the right medicines, you know, to have a big international effort on this that the United States works with others to do. So you could almost imagine each of those issues. And, you know, as I said, on the trade side, it's going to be different, but I'll give you sort of two very practical examples. I saw that former Vice President Biden has a Buy America provisions. Well, what if we could expand those to at least Buy North America? So emphasize the regional aspect. And if they do negotiate something with Britain, which should be easier for the labor unions, why just do it as the US? Let's do it with the 3 North Americans again. So again, you know, these are small steps, but I think they could send the right message. I also think for the long run on the immigration issue, I felt this for, you know, when I worked on the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Central America needs help, as you know, from the Colombian experience with governance and security. And it's something that the United States, Mexico, Panama, Colombia, and others could share experience. But this can't just be done by sending people back. You have to deal with the source of the problem.
I know our time is running out, but I know these are things you think a lot about. When you think about the skill set that you require today, as you look at this past of history for US diplomats and for diplomats in general, what do you think in this day and age are the critical things to look out?
Well, not surprisingly, I'd start with some knowledge of history, but not just because I enjoy it, but to give people a sense, and this is what I try to do in the book, history is multidisciplinary. So it brings different perspectives. And it gives you a sense of what has worked, what hasn't worked, what conditions might be different. I'm not a big believer in drawing analogies because they often mislead, but I do believe history helps you think about questions to ask in a problem. Now, of course, in an institution like the Inter-American Development Bank, you need to have some specific skills, whether it's in economics or finance or engineering or law or health or other human services area. But I guess what I would then suggest to people, and this again comes from at least my study of history, is how do you bring those together to think about solving a problem? Don't just apply the analysis. How do you try to get some results? I'm sure you've had this experience, Luis, Alberto, when some of my colleagues would come through my door and they'd express a bunch of frustration about whatever topic it was. I would often say, well, that's interesting. So what is the question you would like me to address, and what would you propose? And I was trying to build a discipline of these things. And for younger people coming up, I think one of the best approaches is to put yourself in the shoes of your boss. So don't just think what you want to present. Say, if I were in his or her seat, what would help that person get something done? And what I found, I had the opportunity to work for many talented leaders, is that if you start to put yourself in their shoes, you're starting to think like a decision maker. It's a greater likelihood you'll become a decision maker over time. I would apply that also from development work with countries. So when I was at the World Bank, like IADB, you've got a lot of talented people, but I said, look, we can't just give textbook answers. You have to try to understand their problems, their political context, what works into their, what can we take from around the world, conditional cash transfer programs for safety nets, sort of fiscal programs, others, but how does it work in the country? So always think about solving problems. And the last one, which I've given to a number of younger people over the years, they found amusing, but a number of them have come back and said it was the best advice they got, was pick your boss. You keep thinking the boss picks you, which is partly true. But it doesn't mean you have to admire everything about the boss, but pick the bosses that you think you can learn from, whether they've got additional skills, insights. So in a way, it's like history. It's multidisciplinary and problem solving.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. This has been a fascinating conversation. As every time talking with you, I really, really recommend people to look at your book. I know you put a lot of work into it, because just to think this huge body of work, going back in history from Hamilton, the real big thinker in the beginning of your republic, I truly recommend this book. Like you say, it's anchored in history, but it's also a way to understand processes and how people influence them. So thank you so very much for your time. And I know that the people who read your book will get a lot out of it. And thank you very much for spending the time with us, and for always being a great supporter of Latin America, as you've always been, no matter where you have been in your public life. So thank you.
Alberto, let me just pin it that thank you. I hear your term may be coming to an end, and you've done a great job. We had a great partnership when I was at the bank. For other people who may not know this, Luis Alberto helped me connect with a lot of the regional banks and do things like anti-corruption programs and others. And you provided wonderful leadership and been a great friend. And I know the people at the Inter-American Development Bank work every day on these issues, and I, for one, very much appreciate their commitment.
Thank you so much, Bob. Have a great day, and thank you very much for your time.
Buenos dias.
Bueno, gracias.